All right, everyone, it is just about 5:30, so we can go ahead and get started with this webinar. We'll learn a little bit about some of the movers in our own state here, so those animals that migrate. And I see before we started this, some of y'all were sharing some of your favorite migrators, and some of those mentioned we'll actually be discussing today, so it'll be a fun opportunity where hopefully you can learn a little bit more about them as well. So just before we get started, I do want to go over a few different things in webinar basics as we move along through this. First, I'll introduce myself. My name is Lauren McLeod, and so I'll be presenting this information to you throughout the next, less than an hour or so. And I am the Southern Region, so out of the Las Vegas office, the Urban Wildlife Coordinator for the Nevada Department of Wildlife. And helping out today, we have Abby, who is our Angler Education Coordinator. And she will be helping to moderate that chat box that some of you have already made use of. And we also have a question and answer feature that I highly encourage you to use throughout as well. And so those features can usually be found either at the top or the bottom of your screen in a toolbar. The question and answer option, I encourage you to use that if throughout the presentation you're confused about anything or want further explanation on something, and Abby is going to help clarify that. And I'll also take some time out of the end of this program to answer any questions that were not able to be answered during it. And then the chat option, I love this feature because it makes me feel like I'm talking to myself less. So I will definitely be making use of that so I can get your perspective on things throughout this webinar and see if we can come up with some answers together using that. And just some webinar basics too, just so you know, you can see me and hear me, but I cannot see and hear you, so you don't have to worry about that. And as far as the use of the chat and question and answer options, just make sure that we're keeping this all PG. We do have kids that are joining this and other folks that want to make sure that we're being respectful of everyone and making sure that we're keeping a nice positive community in there too. All right. So we are going to be spending this time talking about migrators. And this is a part of a category that's actually part of what we call Nevada Knockout. So I don't know if any of you have heard of Nevada Knockout. This is a program that the Department of Wildlife has been putting on for the last few years. But I would like to launch a poll just to get an idea for some of you that may have participated, or some of you that have never heard of it, or some of y'all that have heard of it but haven't participated quite yet. So it looks like, yeah, most folks have never heard of this. So this is exciting. I can introduce that concept to you a little bit and hopefully you can play this year. We have some folks that looks like they've joined in on the fun before, and some that have heard of it but haven't participated quite yet. So awesome, and I'll give just a little bit longer to see if anyone else wants to vote in that as well. And this is just so I can gauge an understanding for what you're familiar with in regards to the program. And we can talk about it a little bit as well. It's essentially, it's a great opportunity for students in the classroom or adults alike to just learn a little bit more about Nevada's wildlife. And essentially, if you've ever heard of March Madness with basketball tournaments, that's exactly how this is played out. It's a single elimination tournament, but with animals. And at the end, we have one final winner after all of the rounds of animals have banded and battled against one another. So I'm just going to go over a few basics. We're not going to spend too much time on this, but I definitely encourage you to look into it a little bit more. So we can all play this together. And after this program, you'll know a ton about all of the migrators that are participating in the battles this year as well. Essentially, it's 4 categories of animals. They're put out into battle mode, and it is our job to research each of those animals as a participant in this game. So some of the ways you can research the animals is by going on the Nevada Department of Wildlife's website that we put together specifically for Nevada Knockout. And you can find links to that specific webpage on our social media sites, or even just by Googling 2020 Nevada Knockout, and you can find it that way. And essentially, you want to learn all of these different factors that might go into an animal's ability to win or lose in a battle. And then you compete with one another and see if you can come up with the final winner. And so essentially how a winner is determined, it's scored based on intelligence, agility, attack mechanisms, and defensive adaptations. And so you have to do that research and kind of gauge where you think they would stand on the point scale, and when they are put up against one another, see which of those you think would do best by the end of it. And then we will have one final winner with a one-on-one battle from each of these sides and see who the champion is for the 2020 year. And these brackets, this is something you'll fill out and send to us, and they're due September 28th. So you still have a week to research all of these animals, and if you want to play, see if you can determine which of those winners it would be. And I will just show you some of the contenders we have this year. So these are all of the animals that will be engaging in battle during the Nevada knockout season this year. And you will be hearing battle stories for each of these too, so you can understand why or why not an animal might be winning against another. And so those categories, we have Nevada noggins. So those are those animals with that headgear that you see, and a lot of these animals seen here. We have colorful critters. So these are the ones that have a little flashy coloration to them. The cutie patooties, ones that we have deemed are the adorables in the Nevada wildlife categories. And the ones that we're going to be talking about today, which is the Magnificent Migrators. So those are the movers that move through our state. And there are some questions that I'll try to be answering throughout the night tonight, and those are as follows. So first, of course, we're going to talk about migration and what it is. And then we're going to go into why these animals might be migrating. What is the reason for their migration? How do they do it? So there's a lot of animals that employ a lot of fun, different strategies into how they migrate throughout our state and elsewhere. And we're also going to be discussing some of the things that might trigger migration, or some of the things that help these animals to migrate along their migratory paths. And of course, what is our role in it all? So how are we able to help these animals in their moving cycles, and what can we do to help them out during this? So first, I would like to ask everyone else what migration is. So this is a good opportunity for us to use that chat box. I want to get a feel for what you think migration is, or how you would define migration. So we can use the Zoom webinar chat. If you go to your toolbar, you'll be able to find it there. And I do definitely encourage you, when you're answering in the chat box, to change the setting to all panelists and attendees, and that way everyone can see your answers and not just me and Abby here. So I'll give just a few moments if y'all want to use the chat and just share what migration is to you, so how you would define migration. Great. Diana says, moving from one location to another. Absolutely. Yep, seasonally. George added that it's usually a seasonal basis. Very, very true. And that does sum it up, but if anyone else wants to add something else to it, you are absolutely welcome to. And that chat will be open throughout too, so feel free to use it as you'd like. And y'all, we're right on par with it too. It's the seasonal movement of animals from one region to another. And regions can be a very broad term that can describe a very small area or a very large area. And it does depend on the animal that you're referring to. So we're going to move right to the next question, because that was a simple first one. So now we're on question number 2, is why do they do it? So there are a lot of things that might encourage or be advantageous for animals to decide to migrate. So I want us to use that chat again, and I would like everyone to try to come up with the 4 things that they think wildlife needs to survive. So there are 4 factors that are very important in the survival of any animal, including ourselves, that is required for survival. Food, yes, Noreen said food, that is absolutely one. Water, Frank says, yeah. Climate, awesome. Skills, Sophia, very nice. Shelter, oh, this is great. Yeah, some animals need pollen. Very nice. Y'all are just coming up with a bunch. This is great. Food supply, reproduction, temperature. Awesome. Very nice. All right. So let's do the grand reveal. So every animal, whether you are, say, a coyote or a caterpillar, all of these things require 4 very specific things to survive. And that is food, as we said, water, shelter, and space. So all of these 4 things is what make up a habitat. And so every animal that survives in our world needs these 4 things in order to survive. And some animals are adapted for a wide variety of habitat, whereas others might want a specific range of seasons or temperatures and have a narrower scope of tolerance to follow their desirable habitat. And that's when we see migration. We see a lot of cases of migration in animals that might not have that broad scope or ability to survive in a range of temperatures or seasons. And so instead they migrate to follow those areas. So looking at these pictures here, if you're an animal, do you think you could find those resources to survive better in the top picture, or do you think you could find those resources better in the bottom picture? And again, this could very much vary between animal species, but for the most part, I think I would rather survive in the top part where I can have that green grass and shelter available to me. But again, it can vary absolutely for different animals. So one resource or one of those habitat requirements that animals might want to follow is the growing season of the vegetation we eat. So just like in that last picture, we're not seeing as much vegetation in this bottom section. So some animals might need to follow a growing season where they can continue to get the plants that they need to survive. Whereas others might be following the movement or the life cycle of the animals they eat. So we see this more in the carnivorous animals that might be following those other animals that are migrating through the vegetation. And this is a cool thing, it's called migratory coupling. And I'm gonna show you a chart. This just illustrates some examples of migratory coupling. So you can see at the top, the brown bear is known to migrate to follow the migrating Pacific salmon. So there's a lot of different animals that, again, they're just following those specific requirements that they need for survival. And of course, there's fish and sea critters that might head to warmer waters to breed or different bodies of water to breed. And you'll see this chart on the right here. This I just wanted to provide a sort of illustration so you can understand the different types of migration that fish or sea creatures might undergo. So you see, for example, some fish, they may choose to migrate into fresh water to spawn. So anadromous fish will do that. And you'll see, I'll get my laser pointer here. And so they will migrate to fresh water to spawn. And so essentially this is where they're gonna lay their eggs. And then when those eggs are born, they'll go back into the ocean as juveniles and they'll continue the cycle where again, they're gonna go to that fresh water to spawn. And you see this on the reverse side of things. You also see some fish that might choose to stay in the same body of water and just move to different areas of that water up here and down there. And this is something that can happen over several years in order to take care of their eggs, and then they head back to the area that they came from. So this can really range over a long period of time or sometimes on a yearly basis. And another thing that is super beneficial for migration is that they can profit from long days. So this allows more foraging time, especially for those herbivores, those animals that might be following that vegetation. And so when they have long days, they are able to look for their food for longer periods of time. And so this is just an example of the difference in the length of days that we have in the summer versus the winter. And so right now, I don't know if you know, today is the equinox, so we are right smack dab in the middle of the winter and summer solstice. But take a look at the state of Nevada. And we can answer this in the chat too if you all want to share, because I know we're from all different parts of Nevada. And for those of you that might be from different parts of the country as well, if you're from other states, I want you to share how your days differ. So looking at the state of Nevada or the state that you're from, see how many hours you have in the winter versus the summer and see how big that range is. So you can see, if you see the orange and the yellow over here, and then we have the purple and maroon here. And so summer in Nevada, we'll usually get about 14.5 to 15.5, depending on the area that you're from, whereas winter 9 to 10. So you can see a huge difference in those numbers. And you know, if an animal is relying on daylight hours to forage, they would probably want to go somewhere where they can take advantage of that for a little bit longer. And of course, this is typical in areas where the summer is hot and the winter is cold. So where we see those huge fluctuations in temperature, you're going to see a little bit more migration. And so this is a really cool illustration of the United States by not the temperatures that they get, but the temperature differences that occur throughout the year. And so you can see Nevada, we have right here, and it looks like it matches up with the 50 to 60 degree difference throughout the year. And I would say in some areas that fluctuates even more. I know in the Las Vegas area, we can have lows down to 40 and then highs up to, you know, sub 100. And so already we're seeing a 60 to 70 degree change there. So it does vary, but I want you to notice too, if you see along the coast here and down toward the bottom of Texas and Florida, we'll see a much lower fluctuation in temperature. And you will notice that migratory patterns can reflect this as well, whereas we'll have, especially when it comes to birds, a lot less migrators in this region because they're dealing with, excuse me, the same temperatures year round. All right, so we're gonna go on to the fun stuff and learn about some of these animals. Most of the animals I'm gonna be discussing are going to be those that are participating in this year's Nevada Knockout. We're gonna be talking about how some of those animals do migrate. And first and foremost, the most famous of all migrators, we have our birds. So I know just in the chat before we began here, a lot of y'all were mentioning some of the birds that you noticed that migrate. So you saw hummingbirds and geese. So we're gonna be learning about, oh, excuse me, some of those migrators that we have. And our contestant in Nevada Knockout, one of our flying friends, is the Sandhill Crane. So if y'all have ever seen a Sandhill Crane somewhere in Nevada, feel free to share it in the chat. I'm curious to see how many sightings of these y'all have gotten to experience. They have quite the range throughout North America. And you'll see if you look at the state of Nevada, what we have here for the most part is a migratory stopover area and what's called a key staging area. So key staging areas are essentially areas that are really important during this bird's life cycle, whether it's to breed, to breed and find mates or forage. It's a very important stopover site for these birds, which is essential in their cycle. So, and they are pretty common, but their dependence on these key stopover sites makes them vulnerable to loss of habitat in the future. So it's especially important when they have those stopover sites designated that we are making sure that we protect them to the best of our abilities as well. And they have a famous stopover site in Nebraska where you can see over 250,000 birds present at one time there. And you'll see that in the plains area. So here you'll have that key blue stopover site here that they'll use. But it's important to protect them there. You'll also notice you'll see some of these purple sections here. So there are areas in Mississippi and Florida and Cuba, and those populations actually do not migrate. And so that parallels pretty nicely with that seasonal map I showed you a few slides ago that go over the temperature changes in those specific areas. So areas where you're not seeing as much temperature fluctuation for these birds, they're deciding that they don't need to migrate because they have the habitat and resources that they need year round in that one place. And the Costas Hummingbird. I know some of y'all mentioned in the chat that your favorite migrators are hummingbirds. That's super cool. And many that nest in the deserts in spring here, they'll migrate to the west coast. And I'll pop up a map for y'all for this one too. Here we go. So Costas hummingbirds, this specific species is found just in the southern Nevada area, so not so much north of the Las Vegas and southern Nevada area. And you will see that they spend their breeding time in southern Nevada, and they will move south during the winter toward whether it be coastal California or come down to northern parts of Mexico as well. But we do find that with the Costas hummingbird, especially with how many folks that have hummingbird feeders out, we will see a population of these guys throughout southern Nevada year round. And again, that's just because they have those resources that they need to survive. So there's less need for them to migrate south where they can continue to find those resources. So it does depend. All right, another one of our flying friends that'll be participating in Nevada's knockout this year. This is the rough-legged hawk. And so the rough-legged hawk will undergo a migration of more than 2,000 miles round trip, which is a pretty significant distance. You'll see in this map here, they spend their breeding time in the Arctic areas of Canada, a little bit in Alaska, and they'll undergo during the winter a migration as far south as we see the top portions of Texas through the state of Nevada, and they'll spend their winters here. So you can see them wintering in our more temperate climates, anywhere where there's grasslands and fields as preferred habitat for a lot of these rough-legged hawks. And they'll sometimes move in small groups when they're migrating, although typically you'll see that they migrate alone in a solitary fashion, but occasionally you will get to see a large group of them migrating all together, which is a really unique sight. And so this is something that you'll definitely want to look out for on those shoulder seasons as they're passing to and from this area. And also a fun fact about rough-legged hawks is the reason they are called rough-legged hawks is because they have these feathers that cover the entirety of the bird's legs. And so this is really crucial for staying warm in cold climates. They'll even sometimes use caribou bones as part of their nests out on the tundra too, which is kind of cool. All right, so this is a bird. This is not a Nevada resident. This bird is not part of our Nevada knockout, but it is a Guinness World Record breaker, so I thought it was worthy of mention. They have a record that has been made by an Arctic tern that has gone 59,650 miles round trip. And so I don't just have our country on a map here because I had to put the whole world down so you could see the extent of their migration. And their average is about 24,000 miles round trip, but there are some, for example, this record went from its breeding area off the coast of England to Antarctica and then back again. So that is one trip. All right, so we're moving on. We've discussed a little bit about the bird migration, but let's talk about some of those less commonly known migrators. And so we have migrators that come from all different animal categories, and one of them is fish. And so you might be familiar with migratory salmon. There's also migratory cutthroat trout. And so they have a really unique migration history that has kind of changed over time, because as fish migrate, whether it be from rivers to lakes, they also respond to some of the human intervention, like the construction of dams that might affect their historic migratory patterns. And so you can see in this map, it actually illustrates some of the historically occupied lakes and streams in the blue versus what we see in the yellow, which is the currently occupied lakes and streams. And this is just a map of the northern Reno, Nevada area. You can find the cutthroat trout in other bodies of water throughout Nevada and many other counties. And you can actually go on the Nevada Department of Wildlife website and just see how many bodies of water have these trout in them as well. And so they're essentially obligate stream spawners. So they'll generally migrate from lakes between April and July, sometimes as late as fall if the flow and water temperature dictates that. But if a significant portion of these spawning fish, they'll die in the process, while the rest may spawn again. And so it's really important to protect some of this spawning habitat that may have been cut off by dams or degraded by poor grazing practices. And these are all key to future survival of these trout and allowing these movements. And so you'll see that they have historically, I've written up here, migrated 120 miles between Pyramid Lake and Lake Tahoe. So that is one of their longest migratory journeys, which is super impressive. And another kind of animal is mammals that migrate. And so you may be familiar with some mammals that migrate. If you want to share that in the chat, I would love to hear some of the mammals that you might be familiar with that are movers out, whether it be in our state of Nevada or somewhere else. So one of our contenders that we'll be talking about is the mule deer. And not all mule deer migrate, but some will travel about 100 miles between their summer and winter ranges. And I'll show you here, this is just a map of Nevada that shows some of that different range throughout our state and some of those things that might dictate how they migrate and how far they migrate. So you'll notice a lot of these colors displayed give a pretty nice outline of some of the mountain ranges that we have in Nevada. And so you'll see that they are wintering in some of the low desert areas and then migrating to the higher elevations during the summertime. And there's actually a deer that has been tracked that holds the record for one-way migration that went 242 miles one way during its migratory annual cycle. And so this can be extremely variable data specifically. So you may have noticed that during those high and low elevations, you might see a little bit of movement, or again, sometimes no movement at all if they do have a decent amount of resources that they're able to survive off of in the location that they're at. Another mammal, one of our only flying mammals, or is our only flying mammal, is the Mexican Freetailed Bat. And so this species, it's found in a variety of habitats. It goes from low desert to high mountains. They can roost in a variety of sites. So that includes whether you've seen them in caves or under bridges, in mines, anywhere where it can find dark cover, you can find colonies of these Mexican free-tailed bats. And they're a really unique site. In Nevada, some of you all might be familiar, at least in the northerly side, about McCarran Bridge near Sparks, which has about a population of about 40,000 bats that call it home there. And so these colonies can get giant. There's a colony in Bracken Cave. It's near San Antonio, Texas, and that one has been estimated to have about 20 million bats in that colony. So they absolutely travel together. And so you'll see during their migratory shoulder seasons, you'll see huge colonies, so vast numbers of bats all migrating together, which is a really, really unique site. And this map shows here the state of Nevada. So you'll see some of their summer breeding occurs in mostly all of the state, but they will usually in the wintertime move south to Mexico or northern parts of South America and spend their wintering grounds there. We have found that it's possible that some of our southern Nevada residents stay here year-round, though, and that could be due to the warmer temperatures that we have in the low desert area here. All right, another not Nevada knockout contender, but a world record breaker is our blue whale. And so this blue whale is a record breaker for the largest migrator, and that is at 100 feet long. And so there's also another whale that tops all of the migrators have the longest mammal migration of just over 10,000 miles round trip, and that's the humpback whale. But this blue whale here, you'll see is 100 feet long, which is about the length of 3 school buses. And these guys will prefer deeper waters of ocean, but then we'll be seen around the coastal areas as well around Cape Breton and Nova Scotia. In summer, these blue whales will migrate thousands of miles to the cooler polar waters. You can see on this map here, they have their summer feeding area here. So that's where they're going to be occupying those coastal areas, and then they'll go down to their winter breeding areas where they can find the tropical waters as well. And this warm water is especially important because young are born with just a thin layer of blubber. And so that thickens as they mature. So it's really important that they are born into an area that has those warmer waterways until they develop that layer where they can tolerate that cooler water temperature later in life. All right, so we are moving on to arthropods. We've talked a little bit about the birds, a little bit about the mammals. We're going to talk about some of those insects and spiders that also migrate. And so one very famous migrator that y'all might be familiar with is the Monarch Butterfly. And this is a contender for Nevada knockout, and it is also a Guinness World Record breaker. It can migrate up to 3,000 miles. And this occurs not only over one generation, but several generations during its migratory journey. Something really unique about their migration, especially in the Nevada area, is that they exhibit a different pattern than a lot of the monarch butterflies that we see across the way on the eastern side of the Rocky Mountains. So the eastern US monarchs, they'll migrate to central Mexico, and our Nevada monarchs will migrate hundreds of miles to the coast of California every winter instead. And so again, you'll see some of those wintering grounds in Mexico here and on the coast of California and Florida. And then they'll spend their summertime up in Canada, or in our case over here in the northern parts of our state as well. And their migratory cycle, it actually occurs over several generations, which is a really unique phenomenon specific to a lot of insects that migrate. And so essentially, after waiting out the winter in the south, the individuals will head part of the way back on their migratory journey north. And this is really important, where they'll make those stopover sites over the milkweeds that are required for them. And in just a few weeks, they'll continue, their eggs will hatch into caterpillars, and these monarch larvae will consume vast more amounts of milkweed, and then they'll continue the journey. And so this cycle occurs over a few generations as they move north, and that milkweed is a key component of their ability to undergo this cycle as they move north. And then once it is time for them to move south again in the winter, and this is where it's really interesting, it actually only takes one generation. And so it's considered the super generation of monarchs that can live, instead of several weeks like their former, they can live up to 8 months and spend that entire life cycle moving south, where they can start that cycle over again. And in Nevada too, we can see them pretty much statewide, anywhere where that milkweed is present. All right, so on to the desert tarantula. The desert tarantula, has its home in southern Nevada, although we do have a lot of different tarantula species that are found throughout the state of Nevada. So you're probably still seeing a lot of tarantulas up there as well if you're from the more northern parts. But this specific desert tarantula is just one of many migrators in the tarantula family, and this is our contender for a Nevada knockout. But you'll see a lot of tarantula species that will migrate up to 50 miles, and it's not by definition the same migration as might be considered for other animals, but it is a movement in masses of these tarantulas during the fall time when they're seeking mates. And so male tarantulas, you'll find during the fall time, You may find them in groups crossing roads or see them moving about. This is the most active part of their life cycle, where they are not only vulnerable to predators during this grand movement, which is why they spend most of the rest of their lives in burrows, but they're also prone to their female mates that they're seeking out. So it is a very dangerous time for these tarantulas as they undergo their migratory annual cycle each year. And I will point out there is a tarantula species that's in Gabbs, Nevada, that is known for its migration. You'll actually see that specific area where you'll see large masses of tarantulas moving through in the fall, and it's really quite a unique sight. So we're going to go into a little bit of the fun stuff about some of these migrators and what might trigger it. So again, you know, we've kind of learned a little bit about some of those patterns that occur, whether it be in birds, in fish, in insects or spiders, in mammals. You know, all of these animals that are choosing to migrate, they're doing it for the sole purpose of finding that desirable habitat that they need. And a matter of some of the things that help them and trigger this migration can depend on a variety of things. One being visible cues. So if y'all actually want to use the chat again, I would love to hear from you some of the cues, some of the visible cues that you think these animals might be able to use in order to migrate from one place to another. So think about some of the things that they might be able to see in their environment that would help them move and navigate from one place to another. Awesome. Barbara said amount of daylight. Very nice. Yeah. Sunlight. Absolutely, George. Thank you. Oh, very good, Barbara. So how the leaves are changing. Absolutely. Yeah, think about some of the ways that we know when the seasons are changing, when times are to come, especially, you know, if you're from the northeast side of the country, you'll notice fall very clearly. All of those reds, or all of those leaves are turning that bright red and orange. You know, that is a sure sign of fall. Absolutely. Cooler weather. Yes, very good, George. Thank you. All right, and so some of y'all might have been getting to this one. Think about the topography of the landscape. And so when animals are migrating, they recognize certain cues or clues to the topography of the area that they're trying to go to, you know, an area that they might have once been to before, or an area that they know would have that desirable habitat that they need. Yeah, and Sophia added as well, landmarks, absolutely. So they're looking for specific landmarks, and that could even be human-made landmarks like buildings and other structures that might help and hint at an area that they had been to before that they want to return to for their habitat. And again, some of y'all mentioned the sunlight. So the position of the sun is really helpful in understanding where and when they should be migrating, and especially refers to polarized light patterns. So this is essentially formed when light is scattered by airborne particles. And so birds are able to do this, insects and even crabs. They will detect the polarized light patterns, and so they can understand the position of the sun and where it's supposed to be, even on days where it's really overcast and you otherwise wouldn't be able to tell the position of the sun. And this is just a cool illustration. You can see essentially, this refers to birds specifically, as the sun's position will shift throughout the day. That position or pattern of polarized light in the sky will change as well. And so this allows species, again, to find the position of the sun on cloudy days, but it'll also allow them to understand, for example, we're in our equinox and we have a more south-facing sun in the summertime and more north in the wintertime. And so they're able to use some of those cues to understand which part of the season that they should be migrating in during. And this refers to the stars too. So, you know, when the sun isn't out, if there are some animals that might be migrating during the nighttime, they're gonna follow some of those constellations that will help them to understand where in Earth spectrum they are and where they should be heading. And there's also some fun invisible cues that they might be able to pick up on. So if y'all want to share some of those cues in the chat box and see if you can come up with anything that might not relate to some things they can see, but maybe some other factors that might help them in migration. I'd love to see what y'all are able to come up with. Awesome, Lara says Earth's magnetic force, absolutely. Temperature, scent, smells. Yes, this is great. Air pressure, absolutely. Yeah, very good. And those are absolutely correct. So invisible cues, some of y'all mentioned those scent factors. So we have olfactory cues. A really fun example of this is salmon. So salmon will migrate to the open ocean, but they migrate from the ocean to rivers. So they're in that fish chart I showed you, they're one of those fish species that'll go from saltwater to freshwater, where they'll want to spawn. And so they will actually sample the seawater for changing concentrations of mineral salts. And from sampling it, they'll understand exactly where they should be during their migratory cycle based on those mineral salts. And as some of you mentioned too, it's the Earth's magnetic field. So a lot of birds are really in tune with the magnetic field. Butterflies, salamanders do this as well, bats, whales. So there's a lot of different animals that will rely on those magnetic cues as well. And so you can see this is kind of showing the different polarity of Earth. So you can see the North versus South Pole, and the Earth essentially is just a giant magnet. So we have a donut-shaped magnetic field you see here, and those elliptical force lines, they run between the magnetic north and the south poles. And so depending on the species, the magnetic compasses used by animals detect the changing angle of the magnetic force line. So you'll see an angle comes out here and here. And so the north-south polarity, or even the strength of the Earth's magnetic field, can help them to dictate exactly where they should be going. And it's cool, there's been experiments and studies to allude to this, and them using their magnetic cues to migrate. And so there was a study done where monarch butterflies were placed in a chamber that mimicked a reverse magnetic field to what the Earth's scope is. And they showed, so instead of these monarch butterflies migrating north when they should be according to the current magnetic field, these monarchs were actually moving south because of the magnetic chamber that they were put in, which was altered. And so that was them still relying on those magnetic cues in order to migrate a certain direction. And there's a lot of really cool ways that I know I touched on a little bit throughout this presentation, and ways that we can help. So migrators, they're a part of our ecosystem. They all play a very important role in life on this earth and the animals and plants that occupy it. And so there's a lot of really interesting ways that we can, show our impacts and really help some of these migrators out in our state and elsewhere. I know I did mention stopover sites quite a bit, as this pertains to birds like the Sandhill Cranes. It also pertains to those monarch butterflies that rely heavily on milkweed to survive successive generations as they're moving back north during their migration. And so they're essentially crucial to the journey that those birds or those monarchs might make. It can be a place where they rest, where they eat, where they reproduce in the monarchs' cases, or where they prepare for the next part of their migration. And so a lot of times they only spend a short time at these stopover sites, but they are still key in the completion of that cycle. And if you think about Nevada's landscape too, we have a vast amount of desert. And so a lot of the open and more barren land. And so we have a smaller number of those integral stopover sites that have the vegetation or habitat that a lot of these animals need to survive. So it's especially important in our state that we're protecting those resources that those animals will rely on. Another great thing we can do to help these migrators is keeping wildlife wild. So you may have heard that. So again, before, it's definitely important for our wildlife to remain wild, which essentially means that we are not interfering with their ability to find the resources that they need to naturally in the wild. One great way that we can do this is definitely minimizing the amount that we're feeding waterfowl. So you'll see a Canada goose is pictured here, when we feed animals like the Canada goose that is, very dependent on migration, what we're doing is we are discouraging their migration. Again, they need the resources that they need to survive. So if they're at an urban pond, for example, and if they're being fed there on a daily basis, there is no reason for them to want to migrate south, when it's starting to get cooler here, or north where it's starting to get warmer. And so they'll stick around, but by them sticking around, now they're in a climate where they might not be as tolerant of the temperature fluctuations that we get. And so by feeding them, we're actually delaying that migratory process or stopping it altogether, which can actually have a pretty detrimental effect on their survival. And you can see this is just an example of how that not only can affect the birds, but the vegetation and other factors. And it really does have this sort of big wave effect on the things around it. So you'll see, early arrival, if they get to an area too early, they don't have the amount of vegetation that they need. Whereas no arrival, you'll see this vegetation might be getting out of control because it's not getting that same attention by the geese that it might have normally. And something y'all might have seen throughout our state or in other areas are wildlife corridors. And so this is a really, really neat and positive way that we can ensure that our migrating animals or other animals in general are having the protection they need from, some of those habitats that they may have lost due to human intervention, whether it be highways or residential areas. And so these wildlife corridors allow these animals to still move from place to place in some areas that might have been fragmented by, human development that they've had. And so whether they're running or swimming or flying, all animals need to move to complete their life cycles. And so these wildlife corridors are a great way to do it. So you can see this bottom picture. This is over a major interstate. And this is a natural bridge that was built in order to allow animals to safely pass over an interstate area to continue on their migratory path, or maybe just some of their daily survival needs. You can also see things like this. These are fish passage structures. And so these are ways that you can add habitat elements or remove barriers to promote stream health and function, but it also allows for unrestricted movement of fish as well. So these are important areas where there might have been dam constructions or other things that might affect the waterways. And in Nevada, there's actually, it's called the Nevada Fish Passage Working Group, and that's a collaboration between the Department of Wildlife, but also some federal and nonprofit entities that work to improve that habitat connectivity in Nevada, which is a really neat thing to look into if you're interested. So we have gone over all of our magnificent migrators that are included in this year's Nevada Knockout. So I would encourage you, if you want to participate this year, it is really fun. And again, you can find the link to participation on our Facebook or Instagram or any of the social media sites. But you can also, if you just Google 2020 Nevada Knockout, it'll probably be one of the first links that come up as well. And so you can learn a little bit about some of the other animals that are participating too. We are going to have webinars in each of the 4 categories. And if you think there's one that already occurred, which was the Nevada Noggin. So if you check out our YouTube page, you can learn a little bit about those animals with the headgear as well. And at this time, I would absolutely like to open this up to questions. So if there are any questions that Abby hasn't been able to answer quite yet, I can pull up the question box now so I can have them open as well. And I do want to thank Abby for being awesome in answering all of the questions. It looks like there's no open questions right now. So if y'all have any though, I'm definitely gonna stick around for a while and I'd be happy to run over some of those questions that you might have about our migrators or even about Nevada Knockout as well, if that's something that would help. And while you're thinking of all of those amazing thought-provoking questions, I would just like to say thank you for all of you for listening in and for those of you that participated. We do have a survey at the end of each of these webinars that the Department of Wildlife puts on, so I definitely encourage you to fill that out if you're able to, and just provide any suggestions or feedback so we can continue to try to make the best of your interests and hopefully teach you all these awesome things about wildlife here. And as far as upcoming webinars this week too, we have tomorrow we'll have a part of our waterfowl workshop series if you're interested in that. On Wednesday, we actually have our moderator, Abby, putting on a webinar. And this is going to be practicing your cast at home. So she's going to teach you a little bit about fish casting. If you're interested in that, I highly recommend. All of her webinars are awesome. And on Thursday, if you want to learn about one of our other Nevada knockout categories, we will have cutie patooties. So those are all the ones that we have decided are adorable and we think should battle against the other animals. So I encourage you to participate in as many of these webinars as you can. And also we're always welcoming feedback too. If you are interested in a specific topic, we would love to discuss it with y'all.